In the spring of 1941, the streets of Prague carried a silence that was not peace. Under the steady pressure of German occupation, the capital of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia moved with a wary stillness. German military authority, having assumed control after the occupation in March 1939, enforced a strict regime of surveillance, arrests, and censorship. Czech institutions had been suppressed or absorbed into German ones, and public spaces bore the symbolism of the Third Reich. Civilian life appeared normal at a glance. Trams still ran, factories operated, and the city pulsed with activity, but below the surface, resistance simmered. Public transportation had become a tightly controlled organ of the occupation's machinery. Tram routes continued to operate throughout the capital, their schedules preserved partly out of necessity for the city's working population. But every movement, every ticket, every stop, occurred beneath the scrutiny of German officers and Czech collaborators stationed at intersections, checkpoints, and railway nodes. Yet this same infrastructure, operated mostly by Czech civilians, also provided a rare continuity with pre-war life, making it both ordinary and invisible. Among the city's many tram employees was Josef Sousedík, a middle-aged conductor assigned to Route 11, which ran from the Vysočany industrial zone in the northeast to the residential districts of Smíchov in the southwest. Sousedík's appearance was unremarkable. He wore the standard gray-blue uniform of the Prague electric tramways, a cap bearing the municipal emblem, and wire-rimmed spectacles perched low on his nose. His route took him past factories, through the center of Prague, and across the Vltava River. His job was to monitor fare compliance, ensure order on board, and coordinate stops with the driver via hand signals and whistles. He was not a soldier, nor a politician. He kept to himself, lived in a modest apartment in Žižkov, and spoke little to his neighbors. His routine was predictable. He arrived for his shift shortly before dawn, clipped on his badge, collected his fare book, and climbed aboard the tram. At stops, he exchanged brief words with workers, students, and housewives, nodding to older passengers he recognized. The route offered him a limited view of Prague's transformation: German military trucks weaving through intersections, new banners erected outside government buildings, occasional raids in nearby alleyways. But his work required a narrow focus. It was safer that way. Yet like many Czechs in 1941, Sousedík could not entirely ignore the mounting presence of the occupation. In the aftermath of the Czech army's dissolution and the exile of President Beneš, underground networks had begun to coalesce. These groups, scattered, loosely affiliated, and cautious, were focused primarily on information transfer, intelligence gathering, and passive resistance. The most prominent among them was VOD, the Central Leadership of Home Resistance, which attempted to coordinate efforts with the exiled Czechoslovak government in London. But communication was fragile. Radio transmissions were dangerous and often intercepted. Couriers were essential. It was within this atmosphere of constrained movement and constant suspicion that the resistance began to look for unconventional couriers, individuals whose regular movements would not arouse suspicion and who could carry small documents or messages between districts. Tram workers, particularly conductors, offered a rare advantage. They moved predictably, interacted with hundreds of people daily, and were rarely searched unless flagged. Moreover, many tram routes passed close to safe houses, intelligence dead drops, and rail hubs. Sousedík, unknowingly, became a subject of interest to members of a small Prague-based resistance cell affiliated with VOD. They noted his consistent route, punctuality, and discretion. More importantly, he had a reputation among other tram workers for being quietly patriotic but not outspoken. He had once refused to remove a small Czech lapel pin from his coat after the occupation, though he later complied under pressure from superiors. It was enough to suggest a certain resilience, if not open defiance. The first approach came indirectly. A fellow conductor, Václav Halub, casually mentioned one morning that a friend in Smíchov had left him something to pass along. Just a note, he said, nothing important. Halub asked Sousedík to drop it at a cafe along his route. The request was framed as a favor between colleagues. Sousedík agreed without asking questions, placing the small envelope in the side pocket of his satchel. He delivered it as requested, handing it to a waiter behind the counter, who nodded and said nothing. There was no immediate consequence. No interrogation, no reprimand, no odd looks from passengers. In fact, there was no indication that anything unusual had occurred at all. Days passed. Then another request followed. This time, a folded slip of paper was tucked into a book and handed to him at the Českomoravska depot. Again, it was to be left at a specific address, a newsstand near Palackého náměstí. The process repeated itself over the following weeks, each delivery as unremarkable as the last. Sousedík remained unaware of the document's contents. His role had not been explained. The consistency of the requests, paired with the routine of his job, dulled any suspicion. But while the method seemed secure, there were early signs of limitations. On a wet afternoon in early May, Sousedík arrived at a usual handoff point, a bakery near the tram terminus in Vysočany, only to find the building shuttered and the contact absent. The package, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, remained in his coat for 2 full shifts. Not knowing what to do, he eventually left it under a bench at Florenc station. The parcel was retrieved, but word soon spread within the resistance that Sousedík had not followed protocol. Though he had never been briefed on any such protocol, it marked the first hint of a deeper problem. He was a courier, but not a participant. Simultaneously, the Gestapo's counterintelligence efforts in Prague were becoming more aggressive. By the summer of 1941, surveillance units had increased inspections of tram routes suspected of facilitating resistance activity. Several arrests were made near transit hubs, and tram staff were periodically questioned. Rumors circulated of informants among the tram company's administrative staff. Conductors and drivers were advised to avoid unnecessary contact with passengers and report suspicious behavior. Within this tightening environment, the use of public infrastructure for clandestine messaging grew increasingly precarious. Sousedík remained largely unaware of these developments. He noticed an uptick in uniform patrols and more frequent fare checks by German inspectors. He kept his head down, performing his duties with quiet efficiency. Yet a subtle shift had begun. On 2 occasions he noticed the same passenger board at different points along his route, once in Karlin, then later in Nussel, always seated in the back, always silent. He made a note of it but said nothing. Around this time, he also received a package that had no designated drop point. When he asked Halub for clarification, the man simply said, "Hold it for now. You'll know." It was not reassurance. By late June, the resistance network that had initiated Sousedík's role began to experience disruptions. One member was detained outside the Maastricht railway station and had not been seen since. Another had vanished following a house raid in Holsovis. While the reasons for these disappearances remained uncertain, the pattern suggested compromise. There were concerns that the network had become too reliant on tram-based transfers, and some questioned whether unwitting couriers posed a liability. Others defended the method, arguing that precisely because individuals like Sousedík were uninformed, they were less likely to crack under pressure. Nonetheless, the system was under strain. For Sousedík, the summer of 1941 passed in quiet repetition. Each day brought the same clang of tram bells, the same gray avenues, the same tired faces. Yet the rhythm was no longer stable. Small irregularities, missed rendezvous, altered drop instructions, new faces accumulated. He did not ask questions. But in the background, the roles he played were slowly changing, and the space he occupied, between routine and resistance, grew narrower with each passing week. By August 1941, German pressure on Prague's civilian infrastructure had intensified. The Gestapo's intelligence division, increasingly concerned with the fragmentation of Czech resistance, launched a broad campaign to dismantle informal communication channels. These efforts were not driven by clear evidence but by a methodical suspicion that ordinary civic routines, postal services, rail operations, and even public transport could serve as unintended conduits for subversion. Inspections became more aggressive, with officers boarding trams at random stops, inspecting personnel badges, and examining passenger documents under the pretext of fare enforcement. Tram conductor Josef Sousedík continued his daily route without deviation. His outward composure, punctual, silent, indifferent, allowed him to remain unremarkable. But among the resistance cells still operating in Prague Center, doubts about his continued involvement had begun to surface. At least 2 scheduled transfers had failed without explanation. A small envelope left at a news kiosk was never recovered. A contact on the receiving end of a book drop at Nemesti Miru had been arrested days later, and though it was unclear whether the 2 events were related, paranoia set in. The core problem was structural. The resistance network had relied too heavily on the assumption that tram-based transfers were invisible. The early success of using municipal employees, mailmen, tram conductors, sanitation workers, had created a false sense of security. But by late summer, it was evident that the system was faltering. Handoff points became unpredictable. Some couriers reported being followed. Others quietly withdrew. One member of the cell, identified in later records only as Antonín, argued during a clandestine meeting in a Vinohrady cellar that they were relying on ghosts. He meant, in part, individuals like Sousedík, who carried items without context, unaware of the risk, unaware of the larger mechanism they served. Sousedík, for his part, had begun to sense a shift in atmosphere. The streets no longer offered passive indifference. He noticed longer stares at transfer points. Police vehicles idled more frequently near tram depots. The usual handoffs grew less consistent. And yet he continued. He carried an envelope one morning sewn into the hem of his jacket cuff, delivered under instructions he received with no explanation. Later that week, he delivered a sealed package hidden inside a bundle of discarded transfer stubs. He never knew what the items contained, but the behavior of those who passed them, tight expressions, irregular hand movements, avoidance of eye contact, told him enough to be cautious. The pattern of failure deepened. In September, a resistance-affiliated printer in Smyčov was arrested after a leaflet drop. Shortly afterward, 2 contacts in Holsovis went missing, and a tram driver known to pass messages between Českomoravska and Karlovo Nemesti was removed from duty and never returned. The cell feared it was being systematically dismantled. Not all of these losses could be linked directly to the tram operation, but the correlation was unsettling. Trust, already fragile, began to erode. Some members wanted to terminate the courier line entirely. Others argued it should be replaced with better-informed operatives. But this presented its own dangers. Informed couriers were more vulnerable under interrogation. Individuals like Sousedík, who remained detached, who asked no questions, who believed himself to be performing only small favors for a trusted colleague, still offered a degree of insulation. If questioned, he would have little to reveal. He might even be believed. By October, resistance activity across the city had noticeably slowed. Fewer messages were sent. More instructions were relayed orally and in person, when possible. Josef Sousedík, however, remained in circulation, though the items passed to him had grown rarer. At one point, he went several days without a delivery, a break he interpreted as routine. When the next item came, a narrow envelope folded in half and handed to him by a teenage boy pretending to read a tram schedule, he received it without visible reaction. He delivered it to a basket of discarded newspapers at a residential address along his route. It was gone by the next morning. Around this time, German patrols initiated a new tactic. They began riding tram routes in civilian clothing. These plainclothes agents, tasked with monitoring both passengers and staff, rotated across districts and routes without informing the tram company. They watched for repeated behaviors, frequent riders without clear purpose, individuals exchanging papers, conductors pausing at certain stops longer than necessary. The goal was to identify patterns, even if individual pieces of evidence remained ambiguous. One such agent, a Czech auxiliary working under German supervision, reported what he called a pattern of informal exchanges on Route 11. His notes mentioned a conductor matching Sousedík's appearance who routinely paused at a specific bakery corner in Vysočany, even when no passengers disembarked. The report, forwarded to a local security liaison, was not acted upon immediately but placed Sousedík's name into a registry of persons of interest. No arrest followed. No direct surveillance was assigned. But the margin of safety he had unknowingly operated within narrowed further. Sousedík remained unaware. His concern was directed toward changes in routine, slight delays in tram maintenance, minor reroutes, unfamiliar faces among depot staff. His focus was narrow, practical. His days began before sunrise and ended past dusk. He still shared brief exchanges with Holub, though their meetings had grown fewer. In their last conversation of the year, Holub told him there might be a few weeks without anything. Sousedík nodded. He did not ask why. That winter, the resistance cell splintered. Losses had drained its coordination capacity. Some members fled the city, others ceased all activity. A few joined new efforts aligned more directly with the Special Operations Executive, SOE, which had begun building stronger ties with Czechoslovak exiles in London. But within Prague itself, the informal networks, like the one that had quietly employed a tram conductor, were thinning. Josef Sousedík continued his work. The trams still ran, the streets still filled each morning with footsteps and bicycles, and the occupation still held. But the courier line he had unknowingly supported was no longer reliable. Without being told, he had been made obsolete. Yet he remained part of a pattern, a web of civilian routines that the resistance had once woven into something larger. Even in failure, his movements had mattered. If nothing else, they had bought time. As the winter of 1941 gave way to the early months of 1942, Prague streets remained blanketed in a grim order. Snow fell on statues bearing German flags, and posters urging loyalty to the Reich flaked at their corners in the wind. Despite the oppressive normalcy, the city was undergoing an internal tightening. Reinhard Heydrich, recently appointed acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, had initiated a brutal campaign to break the resistance. Mass arrests surged, trials were expedited, and executions were carried out with cold efficiency. The German administration called it Festigung der Ordnung, the consolidation of order. For Josef Sousedík, now into his third year as a tram conductor under occupation, the political climate was not just dangerous, it was opaque. Instructions were stricter. Transit company managers, once quiet and bureaucratic, now spoke with clipped tones and visible fear. At the depots, signs warned against sabotage. German personnel were more present at control hubs. Even fare disputes could trigger an inquiry. Then, one morning in February 1942, Sousedík received an envelope unlike the others. He was handed it by an older woman with a shopping bag near the Bila Labat stop. Her voice was barely a whisper, "Please take this to Palacky Bridge. You'll see who." She walked away before he could respond. He did not recognize her, nor had he ever received instructions so vague. Normally, deliveries were quietly prearranged, a note, a name, a destination. But this was different. The envelope was unmarked, sealed, and soft to the touch. No names, no dates, no clear drop point. For the first time, Sousedík hesitated. He considered leaving it behind. But he could not ignore what it might mean. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was another trivial message. But perhaps it wasn't. He tucked it inside the lining of his coat. He drove his route as usual, stopping at familiar stations, nodding to regular passengers, watching the corners. And when he arrived near the bridge, Palacky Most, he scanned the tram stop and surrounding street. There was no signal. No waiting recipient. Nothing. On his return trip, he passed by the same location again. Still nothing. And so he did not deliver it. Instead, that evening, after completing his route, Sousedík took the envelope home. He placed it on the kitchen table of his modest apartment in Žižkov, beside a half-filled kettle and a pair of wool gloves. He stared at it for some time. Then, for the first time, he opened one of the packages. Inside was a thin strip of carbon paper, wrapped tightly around what appeared to be a folded map fragment. The document was labeled in German and Czech, with handwritten annotations in red pencil. He recognized some of the names: Karlin, Liben, Vysokany, industrial zones along his tram route. But it was not a city map. It was a diagram of electrical substations. He folded it quickly, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into a tin box in his cupboard. This was the moment Sousedík understood, concretely, that he had not been doing favors for friends or moving harmless messages. He had been transporting materials of military or strategic value. And for the first time, he also understood the risk in personal terms. If this paper had been found on him during an inspection, there would have been no explanation, no appeal. The outcome would be final. That night he did not sleep. 4 days after, he received nothing. The usual intermediaries did not appear. Haleb was absent from the depot. The teenage contact vanished. Even the woman from the tram stop did not reappear. He was left in a vacuum, not quite inside the operation, not entirely outside it. He waited. He watched. Then, one evening in March, he was approached by a man in his early 30s wearing a railway worker's overcoat. The encounter happened at the Smyčev End station, as the tram was being cleaned for the night. The man introduced himself only as Janek. He said nothing directly about the resistance. Instead, he asked whether Sousedík had received a package near Palacky Bridge weeks before. When Josef confirmed, Janek nodded. "You opened it," he said plainly. Sousedík admitted he had. Rather than react with alarm, Janek sat beside him on the tram's rear bench. His tone was calm. He explained that the original courier line was dissolved. Contacts compromised. The cell had broken apart after the Heydrich crackdown. The document was a test, not of loyalty, but of survivability. They had wanted to know who would continue, who would notice the change, who would be willing or even capable of adapting when the structure collapsed. Sousedík had passed in his own way. He had not delivered the package. He had preserved it. He had not spoken to anyone. "You're not one of us," Janek said, "but you haven't failed us either." It was the closest thing to trust that could be extended in that era. That same week, Sousedík made a decision, not out of ideology or nationalistic fervor, but from a growing sense of moral participation. He agreed to continue acting as a courier, but with limits. He insisted on knowing at least the nature of what he carried. He wanted to know the contact faces. He would not accept random drops. Janek agreed. This marked a shift not only in his role but in the broader resistance strategy. Across Prague, a new pattern was forming. Smaller, decentralized nodes began replacing the previous, linear courier routes. Tram lines would still be used, but more carefully. The new model relied less on unknowing agents. It demanded partial awareness, not full inclusion in operations, but an understanding of personal consequence. With that came trust, and with trust, risk. For Josef Sousedík, it meant the war had entered his life not by dramatic confrontation, but by incremental drift, until eventually he made a choice. The tram conductor, once a passive participant, had become something else. Not a leader, not a saboteur, but a man whose daily routine carried meaning far beyond its schedule. By the summer of 1942, Prague was no longer merely occupied, it was disciplined. The assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in late May had triggered one of the most severe waves of retribution in the entire war. The Nazi regime's response was swift and merciless. Mass arrests, executions, deportations. Entire communities were destroyed. Lidice and Lizaki, small villages with no direct role in the resistance, were erased from the map. The message was clear: the Protectorate would tolerate no dissent, organized or otherwise. Within this tightening grip, Josef Sousedík continued his tram work. In the weeks following Heydrich's death, tram service was disrupted in parts of the city, particularly near government buildings and security checkpoints. Traffic was diverted. Passengers grew more anxious. German patrols stopped vehicles at random, often removing riders for questioning. Some disappeared. Sousedík adjusted his posture and language during these inspections. He kept his conductor's cap low, his tone even, his movements slow and predictable. The courier work had grown sparse. The resistance networks were reorganizing themselves in secret, adopting looser structures, fewer known faces, and more rotating intermediaries. Janek, the contact who had once spoken with him on the bench at Smyčev, no longer met in person. Messages were left via code or indirect instruction, often relayed by tram workers who had no knowledge of the network's true nature. When Josef received a transfer, it was wrapped in what appeared to be a service report or timetable correction. The drop-off might be a phone booth, a milk crate, or the back of a bakery. Each detail felt mundane, deliberately so. But that sense of calm was no longer dependable. In July, 2 fellow conductors from other routes were taken into custody. One of them, a younger man from the Karlin depot named Marek Stasny, was known to have shared cigarettes with Josef during depot breaks. He vanished without notice. A rumor circulated that he had been caught with resistance literature hidden under the floorboards of his tram. Whether the rumor was true or not didn't matter. His absence created an echo, one that Josef heard in every silence that followed. Then came the audit. In mid-August, German authorities initiated a civil integrity review of transport personnel. The official justification was efficiency, ensuring loyalty, rooting out inefficiency, and improving morale. In practice, it was a loyalty test. Personnel files were reviewed. Backgrounds were checked. Conductors and drivers were brought into administrative offices and questioned, sometimes by Czech managers, other times by German security officers. Questions ranged from routine to pointed. Have you noticed unusual passenger behavior? Do you communicate with depot staff outside working hours? Do you believe the Reich has improved tram service in Prague? When Josef's name was called, he entered the room with his fare book still in hand. 2 men sat behind a desk, one Czech administrator he recognized, the other in a dark overcoat with no insignia. They asked about his years of service, his assigned routes, his evaluations. Then came a pause. Do you know Marek Stasny? Yes, Josef replied. He was a conductor. We worked at the same depot. Did you have contact with him outside your duties? No, just the depot. Another pause. The man in the overcoat leaned forward. Have you ever seen any passengers leave parcels or items on your tram? I've seen passengers forget bags. I hand them over to the depot as instructed. Do you ever retain items yourself? No. That would be against procedure. The man held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Josef was dismissed without further comment. He returned to his route that afternoon, but something had shifted. For the first time, he considered walking away, not just from the courier work, but from the tram itself. The work no longer offered invisibility. The uniform no longer shielded him. He felt exposed. Yet that same week, a new request arrived. It came not from Janek or any of the previous intermediaries but via a folded card left in the tram's inspection pouch, a small compartment near the rear bench used for schedule changes. The card contained only a street name in Žižkov and a time, Thursday, 17:15. Josef debated ignoring it, but on the designated day, after his route ended, he walked through the narrow cobbled streets of his neighborhood and approached the location. It was a shuttered tailor's shop. The front window was dark. The sign had been painted over. He knocked once and waited. A man in his 60s opened the door a crack, then gestured him in. Inside, bolts of cloth and faded mannequins stood as if untouched since before the war. The man did not introduce himself. Instead, he handed Josef a bundle wrapped in wax paper and tied with string. It contained no instructions, only a phrase written on a note card. Deliver with discretion. Final transfer. Josef nodded. He knew better than to ask where or to whom. But as he carried the package the next morning on his route, he felt the weight differently. This was no routine exchange. Something was concluding, whether the operation itself or his involvement in it, he couldn't say. The delivery point was a church drop box in Malá Strana, tucked behind a column near a tram stop. Josef made the drop without incident. No one watched. No one followed. But 2 days later, he received notice that his schedule had been changed. Effective immediately, he would be transferred to a different line, Route 3, running a shorter circuit through Nové Mesto. There was no explanation. When he inquired, a supervisor said only that the reassignment was part of a new optimization plan. The new route took him away from the industrial zones, the safe houses, and the courier channels. He rode past office buildings, civic centers, and residential blocks. His interactions with resistance contacts ceased. Whether this reassignment was coincidental, retaliatory, or protective remained unclear. Within the resistance, the operation was reviewed in hindsight. Some argued that using unwitting civilians had been a mistake. Others believed it had bought them time during a period when radio contact with London had failed. But the question of Sousedík, his role, his knowledge, his discretion, was debated. The risk had peaked. The trust placed in him, quietly and without formal agreement, had been honored. But the structure that supported it was dissolving. The war was shifting, and so were the mechanisms of resistance. Josef Sousedík now returned to the same city, the same tram bell, the same uniform, but with fewer illusions. His world had grown more fragile. His silence more deliberate. By early 1943, the pattern of resistance in Prague had changed. The networks that once relied on predictable structures, linear courier chains, stable contacts, and embedded civilians, had been forced to evolve. After the Heydrich assassination and its bloody aftermath, survival required decentralization. Resistance cells fractured, reorganized, and in many cases went dormant. The use of tram conductors and postal workers as passive couriers had all but ceased. Josef Sousedík remained in his post, quietly running route 3, a less politically sensitive tram line through the heart of Newtown. The change in assignment had removed him from the delivery paths and contact zones he once, unwittingly, moved through. Whether it had been a precaution by resistance sympathizers within the Transport Ministry or the outcome of scrutiny from German security services remained unspoken. No one questioned him. No one asked what he had carried. And no one came to him again. He returned to routine. Day after day, he clipped tickets, answered short questions from passengers, and noted schedule discrepancies. The rhythm of wartime life continued in Prague. The city bore the marks of war. Rations tightened, surveillance increased, and public morale fluctuated between resignation and quiet defiance. But there was no clear turning point for men like Sousedík. No victory, no recognition, only the long, uncertain continuation of life under occupation. It wasn't until well after the war, in 1946, that his name appeared briefly in a declassified summary from the Central Committee for the Documentation of the Resistance. The file, sparse in detail, identified him as a non-formal courier used during 1941 to 42 in limited operations. The report acknowledged that he had not been fully aware of the items he transported but had displayed notable discretion and reliability under unknown pressure. No recommendation followed. No award was issued. The line was buried in a longer assessment of Prague's urban resistance structure. Josef never publicly spoke of his role. After the war, he returned to work for the reconstituted Prague Public Transit Company under the new Czechoslovak government. He retired in the early 1950s, having completed nearly 3 decades of service. He passed away in 1957, quietly and without ceremony. It was only in a 1974 internal historical review, prepared by a municipal archive in Prague, that a brief note was made about wartime conductors and their peripheral role in underground operations. The name Sousedík appeared again, this time in a footnote, as an example of involuntary resistance participants whose silence served the nation more than they knew. His tram never left the city. He never crossed a border or fired a shot. But for a brief window of time, amid the vast machinery of occupation, Josef Sousedík moved messages, names, and fragments of hope between hands that never met, simply by doing his job with care, and by knowing when to say nothing.